Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and I finally settled into college. Dual major in communications and cinema, if you were wondering. Anyways, I'll be back at full throttle soon enough, and the Cyto content will once again flow like nectar. I also ought to take this time to mention that I set up an official Cytonox Discord server, so if you have any interest in that, then just check the description and it's linked right there. As the title may have informed you, this video will be all about ranking the bosses of Wind Waker from worst to best, who thankfully are far better than the dungeons that house them. No need to waste any more time, let's get into it. Goma is last, sure, but honestly, if this is the worst boss in your game, you're doing just fine. Finding a good angle to latch onto Valu's tail is a bit awkward, but it's a rather creative way to take down a boss, which I think is more valuable. In a series where each boss fight tends to rely on using a dungeon item, many of which are repeated throughout the games with no changes, finding novel things to do is high on the list of what I would do if I wanted to design a more distinct boss fight. If you look at the droves of bosses weak to bombs, what do? Chuck bombs in its mouth. Like, literally unfailingly this is the case. Unless you add some kind of pizzazz to the fight, you're basically fighting reskinned King Dodongo in every dungeon where you unlock bombs. Goma is down low because I feel like it gets repetitive and probably would have been better off breaking the Nintendo rule of 3 and only requiring 2 cycles of dirt dropping, although I'm sure hell will freeze over before they ever break that unspoken rule. Wind Waker has fun movement in combat, so the second phase where you gotta slash his eye is more engaging than it'd be in most other Zelda games, so props for that too. This isn't even my favorite appearance of Goma in a Zelda game, which come to think of it is sorta odd. Not sure why they chose this one particular middle-of-the-road boss from Ocarina of Time to induct into the Les Enfants Terribles project, but it worked well enough, so I won't knock it. As much as I love the Wind Temple, I gotta be honest about it here. This boss makes no fucking sense. Why is the Wind Temple boss a sandworm? What does wind even have to do with sand? Was this insane foreshadowing for the reveal of the Gust Bellows almost a decade later? A reference to Ganondorf's coveting of desert wind? I think the answer is the boring meta one of, they just thought it'd be cool to put this guy here. Getting hit by Molgera is rare, so any damage you face is likely at the hands of his little spawnlings that follow you around until you hookshot him out and cut him up. How adept you are at this will determine a lot of your feelings on the fight, but I should add that anybody who's been playing for completion and collecting all the heart pieces should be able to tank like 100 hits from these things without issue. The main issue with this fight is that it's a hardly disguised waiting game, with you spending the majority of the time just rolling around until Molgera shoots his eye stalk thing up to be hookshotted right over into your sword. If he could attack in more engaging ways, it'd be a solid spectacle, but it just feels a bit empty as is. Molgera is pretty much the lamer prototype of the Molduga from Breath of the Wild, the similar names probably being intentional considering how many references to past games are sprinkled around in there. Not a bad fight, but I don't know why this would be someone's favorite. This really could have been great, what with the Skull Hammer being the dungeon item, but once again it suffers from the running trend of fights being waiting games. That, and they somehow managed to make whacking him in the head with an enormous hammer unsatisfying. Something to do with the animation seems weak to me, maybe it's how unbothered he seems, lackluster sound design, I don't know. Once the fancy setup of outrunning the comically slow running water wears off, it becomes harder and harder to keep up the adrenaline Nintendo seems to hallucinate players experiencing while dodging claw swipes on an every 30-second basis. I've been ragging kinda hard on him. It's still nice getting your revenge on this guy regardless, and him having an actual story role instead of just being a random monstrous goon elevates him beyond a good deal of dungeon bosses across the series. There's a second phase once you bust up his mask where you use his sword on him after baiting a peck, but it's harder to take him seriously when he looks like Roid Rage or Foghorn Leghorn. That plus it's one of those, oh no, I punched too hard and got myself stuck in a wall kind of bosses, which was always dumb to me. I'm not the kind of guy who punches drywall when I'm pissed off, but I guarantee you that if I did, I wouldn't need 15 seconds to take my arm back out. I feel like game developers need to have some kind of conference to think of a better environmental excuse to justify brutish enemies getting stunned like electric walls or something. The Helmarock King is a letdown considering his build-up, but isn't a nuisance and at least has build-up in the first place, which makes him stand out. Some people really don't like this guy, and I can sorta see why. The main thing that bothers me is how fast he recovers from getting his vines hacked down by the boomerang. You get like 2 nanoseconds to bust up his core before he ensnares you in one of the most boring, drawn-out animations I've ever seen. This probably takes like 7 seconds, but it feels like a minute, putting even the worst fighting game command grabs to shame. Why couldn't this be like 2 seconds at most? That's literally less work for the animation team. Absolutely baffling that they went above and beyond to make this worse. That said, this is the only real issue I have with the fight, and it's entirely avoidable if you don't get greedy, so it's far less annoying than most. You control the pace of the fight and not vice versa, so there aren't any stretches of standing around, kicking up dirt, and watching tumbleweeds, so to speak. The boomerang is at its best in Wind Waker with the multi-targeting and satisfying sound effects, so the driving mechanics are sound all the way through. This is also one of the best looking bosses in the game, just behind 2 others higher on the list. You even have the possibility of death faintly looming over you thanks to how early in the game this fight is and the boss actually trying to kill you. Overlooking that one pitfall I mentioned earlier, this fight is alright, which is good enough for me. I never played Roblox, but my younger brother briefly did back in the day, and I remember the only time he told me to watch was when he found this game where you shoot Teletubbies in a COD Zombies-like format. This, along with SMG4, served as my introduction to Teletubbies, convincing me that they were in fact hilarious. My first playthrough of Wind Waker was not long after that, maybe early 2015, so it's no wonder I got a real kick out of Zelda. This design for the pose is dumb as bricks, but I love it for that. In every other Zelda game, pose are annoying as shit, defined by taking a long time to kill thanks to becoming invulnerable and being present in large numbers. Wind Waker lets you determine when they're vulnerable, a common denominator in any game with fun combat, might I add, and I thank them for it. Their big boss is the same way. Blast him with sunlight till he keels over, then chuck him into the wall to impale him against the spikes. Or, make him explode into smaller Teletubbies you chase around and massacre progressively. It's an uncharacteristically goofy way to cap off the otherwise dull and gray Earth Temple, but I'm thankful for that, really. Could've used a lot more colors, so I won't begrudge Zelda at that point. This fight is the top of the mid-tier entries in my opinion. It's not exciting by any means, but honestly, I don't think there's even 10 fights in the whole series I'd say make me feel any kind of emotion besides passive amusement, so whatever. This fight is a real interesting one. 3 phases, you don't see that very often here. First one is definitely the strongest, but they're all pretty cool in my opinion. That worm one at the end is fun because it's actually hard to hit once it hits full speed, so you feel like a real sharpshooter making all those shots. Plus the light arrows are great here, my favorite instance of them in all the games personally. Shooting those orbs, slowly cracking them, it's all satisfying as hell and a refreshing break from the deluge of eyeball weak spots we're used to now. Look, I love Twilight Princess as much as the next guy, probably more, but I won't deny that the boss designers got a little lazy on the creativity front in that regard. The return of the boomerang is a welcome thing, but this time the boss is able to move and do things, which makes it a tad more intimidating than Kaldimos. Puppets in general are a cool thing for a fight because they have this eerie uncanny valley thing going on, which I'm a fan of. The spider is the least interesting. Just checking the floor reflection and busting his nuts with arrows is fine, but not mind-blowing entertainment either. The main strengths of this boss are the variety and light arrows, although I gotta add that the arena is nice as well. Pretty strong finale, and fortunately not one of those awkward but all too common cases where the penultimate boss eclipses the last one. If you ask people which Zelda game has the best Ganondorf, Wind Waker is probably the most common answer. Not only is his fight cool, as it often is, but he's the most human of them all, which is always compelling. It's not one of those trendy, morally gray situations, but you see enough of a person inside his head to at least be recognizable as an entity with a personality more fleshed out than Jiren. I have seen people claim that Ganondorf was right and that the goddesses were being dickheads, which is arguable, but discounts the fact that no matter what your stance on living on land once more is, Ganondorf was 100% gonna rule with an iron fist. He has a real track record of inflicting torment and ruin onto the average layperson, and I don't think his affinity for the desert wind means he'd be any different here like some seem to think. The setting of the ocean pouring down back into Hyrule is an amazing set piece, and the fight makes good use of Wind Waker's slightly more robust than average melee combat with the parry mechanic. Zelda being an asset in the final boss is nothing new, but it's cool that she's actually in the thick of things with you here instead of safely out of danger. Tetra is definitely my favorite version of Zelda, I might as well add. Hell, Toon Link is my favorite Link, just off topic, but letting you guys know Wind Waker may be my least favorite 3D Zelda game, but it does a ton of stuff right that just doesn't tend to come up in my videos. Another thing I loved was the finisher. Impaling Ganondorf through the skull was absolutely brutal considering the rest of the game's relative tameness. Reminds me of this old cartoon animator saying that if you want to animate a kind of gory fight scene, you use robots. Lots of loopholes around ratings, I suppose. All in all, an amazing way to cap off the otherwise dreadful dung heap that is Ganon's Tower, and I'm glad that the game at least ends on a strong note. Okay, I feel a little funny about this, but it's just my honest-to-God opinion. Godam looks awesome, has a badass arena, is just overall fun. He's the king of all head and hands bosses as far as I'm concerned. For one, his attacks are actually sort of cinematic, like the cluster volley of explodey orbs. Sure, you can dodge by just running around, but rolling past feels badass. I also love having to aim to hit his weak points. Well, sure you don't have to, but I feel like it's a fun way to add some challenge to the fight that most bosses don't allow for. The neon look is quite literally one of a kind in the sphere of Zelda, at least before Breath of the Wild overdosed on it. So I gotta shout out the animation where you detonate a bomb in his mouth and you see smoke come out of the nose, probably what knocks all those arrows loose. And before you say it, yeah, I recall my earlier rant about throwing bombs in a boss's mouth being lame and overdone. I'm a hypocrite and a fraud, and I should be crucified where I stand. I know. It just works here for some reason. Can't say much more than that. Only fitting that the best dungeon is topped off by the best boss. Real great stuff going on in that there tower. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. With this awkward chapter in Cytonox's history concluded, things should be back to normal more or less, so stay tuned for more uploads as always. That's all for now. Deuces.